Hello everyone, I am Tishya Majumdar and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on forced migration curated under TMYS Review March 2022 in association with Global South Colloquium, University of Victoria. TMYS Review March 2022 under the current theme of migration, displacement and resettlement seeks to explore and understand the niceties of migration from the perspective of forced migration. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. So for today's panel discussion, we have with us Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, Professor Somjyoti Mridha, and Professor Sucheta Mahajan, who will be joining with us shortly. Today's topic of discussion is forced migration and its impact on host communities. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay is Emeritus Professor of History at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. He is the former director of the New Zealand India Research Institute. His primary research interest is in the history of nationalism and caste system in colonial and post-colonial India. He is also interested in the history of Indian migration and the Indian diaspora. Our second speaker for today is Professor Somjyoti Mridha. Professor Somjyoti Mridha teaches at the Department of English, Northeastern Hill University, Nehu, Shillong, Meghalaya. He completed his doctoral research on representation of Kashmir conflict post 1990s from the Center for English Studies, CES, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. His areas of interests are post-colonial studies, ideas of nation and nationalism, Indian English literature. So now, without further delay, I would like to take forward this panel discussion ahead. Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, I would like to request you to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you, Tisha, for inviting me to join this panel on a very important topic in today's context. So, very quickly to introduce this topic, I'll start with a brief introduction to the question of who is a forced migrant and how we differentiate a forced migrant from a professional immigrant who migrates for social mobility. What is the difference? Now, in the available literature, it is argued that in the case of forced migration, only the push factors work, which means that given an option, the forced migrant would never leave their homeland. But still, there's a question that remains. That is, what is the litmus test to kind of decide what is the legitimate push factor which we can consider as a criterion for judging whether it's a forced migration or not. The UN Convention of 1951 prescribes that it is fear of persecution, which is the factor which needs to be taken into consideration. And this is fear of persecution because of one's religious affiliation, race, ethnicity, or political opinion, or membership of a social group, and so on. So if because of this one is persecuted in their own country or feels threatened to be persecuted, that those people have a legitimate right to migrate and be treated and recognized as a refugee under the UN Refugee Convention. Now, under this criteria, we can easily explain or define people like the refugees who came to India after partition, or say Palestinian refugees, or more modern times, the Rohingya refugees who were all migrating, who were forced to migrate because of a threat of persecution. But the problem still remains. How you then define the Syrian refugees? The Syrian refugees from 2011 onwards, this war has produced more than 6 to 7 million refugees. And they were fleeing from a war The war was not against directly the people of Syria, but the people of Syria were caught in between. So the scholars also argue that we have to take a broader vision to judge who is a forced migrant. That is to say, that we in social political theory we argue that there is a social contract always between the state and its citizens, that the state has to provide minimum security and protection for life and livelihood. And when the state fails to fulfill that promise, that security, provide that security, the people also have a legitimate right to migrate and uh, be recognized as a refugee and provided all the necessary facilities for rehabilitation. Now, I mention this because under this definition, broader definition, we can bring the Syrian refugees or the Iraqi refugees, or just today there was an announcement from the Afghan government that there is a possibility of another mass exodus from Afghanistan because of the economic conditions there. I mention and emphasize this to drive home the point that these people who are forced to migrate, every individual has a sad and horrific story to tell. They are not migrating for self-improvement or economic mobility or so on. But when thousands and millions of them spill over into another country, the host society cannot take it. So let's see now from the perspective of the host society. The host society, I think, when there is such a large scale migration of millions, they suffer from what I classify as two kinds of anxieties. One I call the resource anxiety, and the other I call the culture anxiety. The resource anxiety is more immediate. People began to think that these so many thousands and or millions of people have to be accommodated in refugee camps. There needs to be space, there needs to be water supply, food, and so on. So the immediate anxiety is about providing some kind of a shelter and livelihood, and the money that is required for that, funding that is required for that. In modern times, the state that receives them, and also the international agencies, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, United Nations Refugee High Commission, UNHCR, and the international aid agencies, they all come forward. But there's a second phase. The first phase of the refugee influx is that they spill over into the neighboring countries. And from neighboring countries, they then move further to other countries where they are rehabilitated. And in those countries also, the initial impact was about resources. And when they moved to the welfare countries like Europe or Australia, New Zealand, or USA, the immediate anxiety is about resource anxiety, that these people will jam our health system, these people will overburden our education system, and so on. So the immediate anxiety is about resources. But there are ways how this resource problem can be solved. And in most cases, however satisfactorily or unsatisfactorily, these problems are handled. The second anxiety, which I call the cultural anxiety, that comes from our inability to handle cultural difference. But this cultural inability works in different ways. It's a much more complex problem. The same group of refugees can create different kinds of cultural response from the host society. For example, just to give you an example, I mean, when the Syrian refugees come to Turkey or Jordan, they create less cultural tension than the resource anxiety. But the same Syrian refugees, when in 2015 entered Europe by crossing the Mediterranean, they created more cultural anxiety than the resource anxiety. Let us see the other way around. The more recent Rohingya refugees, when they came to Bangladesh directly from Myanmar, they created less cultural anxiety and more resource anxiety. But the same Rohingya refugees, when they entered India, they created more cultural anxiety than the resource anxiety, so to say. So it's a much more complex phenomenon, and it differs from situation to situation, and also it differs on the basis of how the recipient states handle these problems and can manage the whole society as such. So these are my very brief initial observation. I can come to more details later on. So over to you, Tisha.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very enlightening to hear you. I would now like to request Professor Somjyoti Mridha to present his views on today's topic.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Majumdar. Well, I mean, Sir has already sort of said some of the most significant points regarding migration. I was just thinking, the panel has been sort of titled as a forced migration and impact on host society, etc., etc. I was actually wondering that, and this is what I believe, that I guess most migration is actually forced in some way or the other. There is a little bit of coercion involved in it. The push and the pull factor is, of course, there, but I guess even those people who wishes to sort of get better opportunities and all, and move to, let's say, more economically developed countries in the West, especially, are also in some sense or the other some kind of way we can define as economic refugees. So it is possible to sort of demarcate that, though of course the circumstances are very, very different. And we are most probably focusing more on armed conflict, because I did see that written on the flyer, etc. So, as I said, that migration most probably is generally forced in generally, but of course there is a need to sort of differentiate it from, let's say, voluntary migration, that the one that I was sort of referring to. Well, I mean, forced migration could be because of various reasons. I mean, one is, of course, the armed conflict, which has been mentioned, but there could be a number of other things. For instance, ethnic tensions. There need not be an armed conflict as such, but there could be ethnic tensions. The situation that has been happening, let's say, for I don't know how many years, it's 70 odd years, that's happening in Bangladesh, let's say. The continuous flow of immigrants coming into West Bengal because of persecution over there, and this has been sort of going on, and so it's a slow mo ethnic, religious tension, etc., etc. And there could be a number of other things. One of the new categories for forced migration could be also developmental projects like dams and various other developmental projects lead to sort of migration and also dislocation, not necessarily migration, but yeah, of course, dislocation will, and also, I guess, natural disasters need not necessarily be armed conflict, but also natural disasters, and they lead to a lot of that sort of thing happens in the context of Assam, because Brahmaputra floods every year, and then it leads to total inundation of villages, and then those people are supposed to migrate to other parts or other villages, and then they are regarded as new immigrants into those villages, and complicating the whole structure, the ethnic tensions, etc., etc., again leading to different kinds of political narratives, because these people are then regarded as new immigrants and labeled something, etc., etc., and that sort of thing. So I guess forced migration can happen for various reasons, not just armed conflict. That's one of the point that I am trying to sort of make over here. And the other thing that is very crucial, and Sir has also pointed out certain specific instances, is that whatever be the reason, armed conflict, and since my work is primarily in the context of Kashmir, I mean, it is invariably that the weaker section, which could be ethno-religious minority, or the poorer people, the poorer sections of the society, who are invariably affected. It is possible that the majority community, or the more powerful, the power elite, also share certain concerns of those minority, but they are not necessarily affected. It is only the ethno-religious minority, or the people who are disadvantaged from the economic means are forced to migrate. This is across all sorts of problems. I mean, including armed conflict. For instance, in the context of Kashmir, I mean, all sections of the Kashmiri Muslims were not very pro Azadi, or were not really interested in that sort of political independence from this Indian Union. But they were not forced to migrate. Of course, there were targeted killings of very prominent members of the Kashmiri Muslim communities, along with very prominent members of Kashmiri Pandit communities. But the, the Kashmiri Muslim community were not forced to migrate those sections. It is the Pandits who were forced to migrate en masse in the context of Kashmir. Similarly, I mean, in Bangladesh and other places, I mean, I'm certain that there are very secular minded people who certainly oppose this kind of, religious persecution, but they're not forced to migrate. I mean, it is the minority Hindu community over there who are forced to. So I guess it is always directed, or migration always happens for the more vulnerable section, irrespective of their political or other affiliations. In the context of Indian subcontinent, I believe religious and ethnic tensions have taken a toll, and that is one of the major reasons why uh, you know uh, people are forced to migrate, etc., etc. Now, and religion remains one of the major reasons. I mean, religious conflict, riots, etc., etc. The other aspect is, I was about to say a little bit about the UN conference on refugees, etc., but Sir has already referred. But I guess the other very important aspect regarding this whole term of refugee is that, since this is a recognized category of vulnerability or dispossession, etc., etc., and is internationally recognized, and which most probably also means a certain amount of, what should I say, liability on the part of the state to sort of take care of them, etc., etc. There is also this concomitant politics of denying refugee status, which is something that has played along in the subcontinent for sure. I wouldn't be really very equipped to talk about the international scene, let's say in the context of Syria or otherwise, but in the Indian context, specifically regarding the two instances that I was sort of basing my argument on, the Kashmiri Pandit situation and the Bangladeshi Hindu. In both the cases, they're sort of denied the refugee status. For instance, for the Kashmiri Pandits, the recognized term that is used by the government of J&K is migrant Pandit community. So the idea that they're a refugee community is actually never acknowledged in Sarkari, quote unquote, documents. So they're denied refugee status, though of course certain provisions have been made for them, and they're given, residential complexes, etc., etc. But they're never referred to as refugee, because that, but if you recognize them as refugees, then you have to recognize that there is a serious problem in terms of, ethnic clashes, etc., etc., which the state does not want to acknowledge, and hence they're called migrant. So if you go to Jammu and all, they're saying migrant camps, and the very word accords a certain level of agency to the Kashmiri Pandits, which they did not have when they were migrating. Similarly, similar things happened with the in the context of Bangladeshi Hindus, because then they are labeled as enemy property, or their whatever they left behind is regarded as enemy property. The state quickly takes over them, and then they are sort of distributed, or whatever that is done. And similar things happen in the context of India, because we also have this whole enemy property act, etc., etc. So things have happened similarly. So the denial of the refugee status, which aggravates the sense of, or the quotient of dispossession on those people who are forced to migrate. That is, I believe, a very very uh, crucial aspect. And the other aspect, I guess, not only just armed conflict, but in all instances, including the category that I was trying to mention, economic refugees, I guess this kind of forced migration leads to the creation of what I was just reading Mamdani's book, and leads to the creation of permanent minorities. You create a, what should I say, a social category of permanent minorities who will perpetually remain minority in their host society, and will of course suffer various levels of dispossession, In certain cases, they may also come up and become very, well established in the host society. But for instance, what has happened to the refugees who came over to India during partition, and then some of them have, gone to become really powerful people around. For instance, the Tripura CM is a Bangladeshi migrant, and people have gone on to become really important people, etc., in the host societies. But you will create a certain kind of permanent category of permanent minorities in the whole scheme of things. So I guess, do I have time? I guess that's more or less what I wanted to share. But thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very insightful. So now, without further delay, let us move on to the question answer session. So my first question is to Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay. It is sometimes seen that when refugees settle in the host countries, it results in employment crisis and decrease in wages for the locals. Could you throw some light on how the government and private sectors can better manage the employment issue? Over to you, sir.
You're mute, sir.
Yes. Yes, I just noticed that. Thank you. Um, well, in response to this question, I will start with a comment on what uh, Somjyoti already mentioned, that is denying the refugee status. I mean, in India, this is endemic, and starting right from the partition refugees, Indian government did not want to use the term refugee for the partition refugees. They were called displaced persons, or DPs. In all official documents, they are called DPs. And government of India did not sign the UN Convention of 1951 to avoid responsibility for providing what is the necessary requirement under the UN Convention. So once you kind of get these people coming in thousands and millions in your country, how you accommodate them within your labor market? The issue is, in this labor market, the refugees who come there have very, very limited access. So the whole point of the whole assumption of your question is that there is an open competitive labor market where these people come in and participate, and as a result of larger supply of labor than demand, the wages go down and they depress the labor market. Now, that does not really happen when it is an international kind of refugee migration. It happens when it is internal migration. The citizens of the same country move from one part of the country to another part of the country, and there they can create labor demand supply imbalance. But that does not happen. I'm not very knowledgeable. Somjyoti would be more knowledgeable on that aspect of internal migration, which he has worked on. I'm more familiar with the international refugee migration situation. And in case of international refugee migration, that rarely happens. Because when this large migration takes place, first in the neighboring countries, they are most usually segregated in refugee camps. Now, we have to remember that when these refugees are coming from a different sovereign state, they do not have the citizenship of the host country. And without citizenship, they do not have legal access to the labor market. So, and in order to maintain that, most of the host states put these refugees in segregated refugee camps where they are provided for, and they do not have easy access outside in the labor market outside the camps. There is a second phase of this international migration, that after coming to the neighboring states, many of them can apply for refugee status under the UN Refugee Convention, and then UNHCR goes through a process, vets the situation of every individual, and if they are given a formal refugee status And here also, the major tendency is to deny them refugee status. If they are given refugee status, then they are rehabilitated in different countries where, once again, they are in a disadvantaged position. I completely agree with Somjyoti that they become a permanent minority in those countries. They suffer from various disadvantages. They do not speak the language. Their skills are not recognized. Their degrees are not recognized. They do not have any social or cultural capital to do well in the labor market. So what they do, they remain on dependent on the assistance provided by the state or the non-government agents, organizations, the NGOs, which the aid organizations. And whenever they get into the labor market, they are usually at the bottom of the ladder, and this refugee labor is the most exploited labor section of the labor force in those countries. They usually take the jobs which the local people would not take. So the whole idea in the case of international mass migration of caused by various social and political upheavals, that they kind of come and depress the labor market, is kind of overhyped. I mean, it's much more complex because the refugees normally are segregated in refugee camps and do not get easy and free access to the labor market to compete with the local peoples. So the local population is protected by that. Even in Indian case, even in partition for the partition refugees who came in 1947-48, that situation was different because they were coming immediately after partition and they had a natural right to the citizenship of India. So they could immediately enter the labor market. But India, Somjyoti was referring to Bangladesh. I'll refer to another earlier period when it was East Pakistan. After partition, there was another mass migration from East Pakistan in the 1950s. Now, 1950s migration, it started from 1950, went until 1957, and about 2.1 million people migrated from East Pakistan to the other side on the border in India. Now, they were not given immediate free access to the labor market. They were all put in segregated labor camps, which were fenced camps. They were not allowed to go out. And I have interviewed these refugees, and they could say, even when they could get out, because it was difficult to kind of totally seal off the refugee camps, when they could get out, they found it really difficult to get a job just because of the fact that they were outsiders, they were refugees, and the local people were always preferred for any kind of jobs. It is true in course of time, in course of generations, they have done well, they've settled themselves, but that's a different story. So immediate impact of such international, I'm not talking about internal migration as such, international migration on the local labor market is, I would say, limited and complex. Over to you.
So basically, in terms of immediate impact, the local communities are more or less protected in terms of employment.
Yes, but there is an anxiety. The
Yeah,
anxiety, the anxiety is created by a lot of political factors.
yeah.
It's the political articulation of people's fear, which always works in all host societies. But if you look at the actual factual details, it is very difficult to show conclusively that such international large scale migration has depressed the labor market or kind of taken away jobs from the local people, because local people are always protected by the state, which tries to put these refugees in segregated camps. But that does not work for when it is internal migration, because for internal migration, these are citizens moving from one place to another where and they could temporarily upset the balance in the labor market.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. So, sir, my second question to you is that what, according to you, are the barriers faced by the student community or minority populations while adjusting in a new country after forced migration experiences? And how can these issues be resolved? Over to you, sir.
Yes, I understand there are two parts in this question. One is about students and one is about the minority. Now, I would say the problem of the students is the real problem, because it is the children in any forced migration which is caused by mainly social or uh, political upheavals, conflicts, or even kind of uh, e- economic dislocations, disasters. Um, the children get uprooted from their familiar world, and they have to adjust to a very, very different kind of situations. Now, I am familiar with the situation of in the refugee camps after partition in India, and I have also looked at the international literature, such as children in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon or Jordan, and so on. So it's the children who suffer most. But most refugee camps these days start schools within the camp. Even in India, all the refugee camps had schools, but I've looked at the infrastructure of the schools. There was practically no infrastructure at all. The government provided for older generation of students, I mean, older students who would go to tertiary institutions, some scholarships to go to the schools outside the camps or to go to the colleges. But even in those cases, they suffered because of being outsider to that local community. But on the other hand, I have interviewed refugees who lived in the refugee camps in West Bengal, and there are now many autobiographies which have come out written by those refugees who lived once in those camps. They see those schools as some kind of a light in the midst of total darkness. They still have fond memories of those schools which gave them some kind of a childhood. And so, in other words, although it was difficult, children adjust more quickly than adults. So the schools in the refugee camps became one of those kind of place where the children could find themselves and through their friends some kind of a childhood in the middle of what was immense misery, immense darkness, and sufferings all around. But the other thing in the partition refugees, in the case, you'll see that these refugee families are very resilient, and they know that in order to stand on their feet in the long run, they had to get their children educated. So they tried all their best to get them educated. So the students suffered most, but they also adjusted, and they also showed immense amount of resilience, and they fondly remember those schools which were kind of one kind of open space for them. The question of minority is completely different, as I completely agree with Somjyoti that the refugees constitute a permanent minority in any society. And even when they are given a formal refugee status, they are still discriminated as outsiders. And there is, in every host society, there is a continuous othering process, and these refugees suffer permanently from this. In international situation, much more, because I have seen New Zealand, for example, has a very good refugee rehabilitation system. But even then, these refugees suffer from various disadvantages. They don't speak English, they don't have the skills, their degrees are not recognized, so they do not get a fair field to compete with the locals in the labor market. So they remain permanently a minority and an exploited class of labor. Okay, that's more briefly my comment. Hello, over to you. You're muted. Yep.
Okay. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, now.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. It was, yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you so much, sir. It was really, it was really nice to hear you. Uh, so now I will move on to Professor Somjyoti Mridha. So my first question to you is, how does a strong sense of nationalism among the people of the host country shape their attitudes towards the refugees? Over
Yeah,
to you, sir.
yeah. Thank you. Yes, this is a very tricky question. Nationalism, of course, is a very nebulous kind of a concept. So, there could be various kinds of nationalism, and yes, that does impact the attitude of the host society to the refugees. For instance, in the case of internally displaced, like if you're displaced within the country, then I guess, as sir was also saying, that there's a greater probability, not necessarily, but there's a greater probability of acceptance, and hence some amount of basic facilities being made available to the refugees as such, which also may not necessarily be the case all the time. But let's say in the specific instance of the Kashmiri Pandits, it was very interesting that a political party which actually bases itself on the idea of a Marathi Manus and Shiv Sena actually was the first political party to provide a special reservation for the Kashmiri Pandit community after the Exodus. Now, that is very, very interesting because Maharashtra is not at all contiguous to Jammu and Kashmir, and but somehow they sort of gave them reservation in the jobs, etc., etc., which was very interesting. And of course, the central government also did a bit of that, the reservation for Kashmiri Pandits and all that. And the word was not the refugee, the word was not used, it was again migrant Kashmiri migrants. Yeah, that was the sarkari word that is used, and it still continues. Very interestingly, I teach at Nehu, and we also have a migrant Kashmiri quota, which is supernumerary. So I was very, very intrigued by the fact that, and that continues, because that whole problem is sort of, it is sort of been executed, because the Pandits have more or less come out of Kashmir, and the conflict is also sort of subsided, but it still continues. So there is a greater acceptance, maybe, if you are within the nation, and also it works in the context of Kashmir, because let's say the minority in the context of Kashmir is also the majority in the context of the Indian nation state, and therefore there's greater acceptance, as Sarah said, in the labor market, so to speak, or in the wider in wider sorry in wider society. uh, but that is just one specific instance. But generally, if you consider nationalism as a as and in the Andersonian model, as an imagined community, and which may not necessarily be similar to that of the official nationalism of the state which various communities belong to. Let's say in India, there are many communities whose idea of nationalism or nationness is not sort of contiguous, or rather identical to that of the official version of Indian nationalism. I think in those contexts, things may get a bit tricky, and it will not, I guess, any kind of, this anxiety of the outsider is something that is prevalent in every society to a greater or lesser degree. And if it is a close knit compact community, then I believe the anxiety of the outsider is much more. And in those areas, I think things will not be, things will be much more difficult for the refugees, so to speak, and the host society will certainly be more hostile towards the refugees. So I guess in order to sort of give you a more qualified sort of an answer to this question, I guess the idea of nationalism has to be sort of spelled out clearly in much more detailed terms. But one of the specific instances, and of course, it's not just nationalism. I guess if there is a certain level of uh, what should I say? If there is a sense of identification on any grounds, whether it be it nationalism, be it ethnic, or be it religious, I and if there is a certain similarity uh, to that of the host society with the refugee population, I guess then the host society is slightly more amenable to the refugees. If such things don't exist, then I guess the host society is way more hostile. And of course, it is sort of conditioned by the political circumstances, the prevailing political ideology, and various other factors. I mean, I guess, yeah, that's more or less my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So it is just not about the idea of nationalism. It is any form of identity, which affects this kind of like a behavior, like they induce such hostile behavior towards the quote unquote outsiders uh, as they perceive them. Right, sir?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. So my next question to you is, when refugees arrive in the host countries, it results in an increasing demand and competition for food, transportation, water supply, education, health services, and so on. How do you think their needs can be better met so that it doesn't affect the local people?
Well, I guess there cannot be any better way. I mean, I believe there will be a greater demand for food and water and all the other amenities. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, of course, the state may take up some of the responsibility, at least for some period of time, and may provide, which I believe in some cases, at least during the partition period, I mean, refugees were provided with some basic facilities, and the Indian government, and I believe it must have happened with the Pakistani government also, because refugees did not just come to India; they also went to the newly minted nation state of Pakistan on both sides. I believe that the states did provide for at least some basic stuff. I mean, considering that I am also like I belong to a family which did migrate during that. I mean, my family does have land which were provided by the government. Now, I don't know which government, whether it was the government of India doing it or the government of West Bengal, but they were given some. But of course, they came in the first batch, 47 ish. I think things got difficult in the for the later migrants sorry, the later refugees who entered India and things like that. But I believe there is no simple way of saying that how can it be better. I mean, there cannot be a better or a worse way. I believe there will be a greater demand, and I also believe that the refugees will be exploited in some form or the other. It is inevitable because the moment you come and everybody will sort of try to make the best out of the circumstances, and since you are at the at the lowest order level in the whole hierarchy of exploitation, you will certainly be exploited. But what I believe is that I guess this food and all can be provided for a period of time, but what should be done, and which is not necessarily the case in most cases, is that I believe that the younger lot should be better trained so that they can contribute in a more positive way to the host society and for themselves as well. I believe that's the only way out in order to sort of get out of this tricky situation. Yeah.
So basically, there is no like long-term solution to this. I mean, there will always be problems regarding the competition of resources.
There will be, at least see in the initial stage, of course there is a serious competition. Since you mentioned food and all, I
Mm.
certainly agree about the job market, because I guess what refugees or new immigrants in any country, even if they're not refugees, they do the most ill-paid jobs, which most probably will not be done by the host community, and even if they're done at a greater price. So people prefer the poorer immigrants vis-a-vis the settled people who will demand a higher price. There will be competition, but in the long run, I mean, various other good things can also happen. There'll be a certain cultural infusion. It will happen over time, and there will be intermarriages. There will be some kind of cultural exchanges, and I believe that sort of thing will benefit the host society in many different ways. For instance, I mean, I believe it was Jodunath Sarkar who once said that don't neglect the refugees to the well settled Bengalis of Calcutta and adjoining areas. And it did happen. I mean, I mean, the the then refugees have really done well in the context of Bengal, and I believe we have had a more fruitful cultural life because of their because of their arrival in some sense or the other. But and similar things have happened in the case of Jammu, because the Kashmiri Pandit community, and which I'm continuously harping on them because my work is primarily on them. I mean, and of course, the Kashmir situation is, the Kashmiri Pandit community is a very educated community. And when they came, of course, they did not have anything. And in Jammu, and they all settled in the camps, etc. But, after their arrival, the whole scenario in education sector pretty much changed in Jammu. They ended up becoming teachers in Jammu based schools, because many of them were government teachers, school teachers and college teachers. And people have actually written that it is after the arrival of the Kashmiri Pandit community that the educational standards in Jammu schools have really come up, and the people have really contributed. The Kashmiri Pandit community has really contributed to the upliftment of the education sector in Jammu. But this is a very localized sort of an insight. May not necessarily be applicable in other instances, and there are many such instances. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's more or less, yeah, what I wish to say.
Thank you so much, sir. So now I will move. I will ask Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay one more question. That is, with the refugees' arrival in the host country, there is an increase in demand for resources such as wood, clear space for shelter, water, or household activities, and so on. This often leads to issues such as deforestation, soil erosion, land degradation, and pollution. What steps, according to you, can be taken in order to prevent such environmental degradation? Over to you, sir.
Okay. Yes, there is absolutely no doubt that when such a large scale migration takes place, there will be problem of resources, and that is at the very beginning I mentioned that is one of the major concerns of the host society, that they will be putting pressure on our health system, on our sewage system, on the water supply. And the first initial problem, particularly after the partition, was to get space where these thousands of people could be accommodated in camps and colonies and so on. Now, this is something um, which is unavoidable, and which can be settled or which can be mitigated by proper state intervention. And the state has to have a rational plan for rehabilitation of these refugees. If you do not have a rational plan for rehabilitation, then this is going to create more problem for the whole society and the whole state. Internationally speaking, the resource problem these days are taken care of in most cases by the UNHCR or the aid agencies. When there is a large scale migration, say the Syrian migration or the Rohingya migration to Bangladesh, all the international agencies came along to provide for assistance in terms of resources. But obviously, the pressure cannot be avoided. I mean, immediately in coming back to India, immediately post partition, Calcutta was overcrowded with refugees. There was not enough water supply. The sewage system could not cope with that. And the result was the outbreak of epidemic. Now, all that there was a serious cholera epidemic in Calcutta just in after the partition because of the refugee influx and because the water supply and the sewage system could not support this additional supply of people in that urban space. But this happened because there was no planning. And there was no planning. This was completely unprecedented. No one really foresaw that so many people would come immediately. But in other cases worldwide, when there is such large scale migration of refugees, they are immediately accommodated in places which are, to in many cases, or I would say most cases, away from the habitation areas of the host society. For example, in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees are located in a remote island. And in Turkey, these Syrian refugees are put in the refugee camps, which is in the outskirts of the urban spaces where there is no local population. So the state planning, with the assistance of the global agencies like UNHCR or the aid agencies, can come up with some kind of a planned resolution of the problem over a relatively longer period of time. There will be certainly an immediate impact, which you cannot avoid. And because this mass migration is a catastrophic event, so you'll have to endure that kind of effect of this kind of movement of large amount of people. Other than this, environmental degradation or deforestation, I have not seen any historical case of deforestation because of refugee migration. There is the only case, which is often mentioned in the case of West Bengal, the Morichapi incidents of 1977-78, when some of the East Pakistani Bengali refugees settled in the part of Sundarban areas. But it is unfair to say that it was mainly because of the refugees that this happened. The incident happened because of much more complex political reasons. The deforestation or forestation, the forest planning of Sundarban had a long history. Long before the refugees were coming, the government in Bengal was planning to have partially reclaim the Sundarban lands, and the reclamation of Sundarban forest was going on for at least 100 years. We have historical evidence that people were going and living harmoniously with the forest. These refugees who settled in those areas were also part of that history of settlement in the Sundarban areas, in the forest areas, and the reclamation areas. So, in other words, their settlement and the government of West Bengal from the very beginning had a consistent plan of reclaiming part of Sundarban for refugee rehabilitation, but which was abandoned later on because of very complex political factors. So, in my knowledge, that is possibly the only one instance where I've seen the direct threat to environmental or ecological balance or deforestation. But I'm strongly against the view to put the whole blame on the refugees. There's a lot more reasons behind it why it happened. It was avoidable. It could be very harmoniously kind of, this environmental damage could be managed, but it was not. The force was applied, which was not necessary. So, in other words, what I'm trying to drive at, yes, there are hazards to environment, but these hazards can be better managed by the state with proper planning. That's my brief response to your question.
Thank you so much, sir. So now my last question is to Professor Somjyoti again. Uh, Sometimes the arrival of refugees may lead to outbreak of certain diseases which affect the health of the citizens of the host country. What preventive and treatment measures can be taken to curb any such possibilities of disease outbreak? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, yeah. This is again another question that I think that I would also like to sort of repeat what Sarah said. This outbreak of diseases happen for various reasons. Okay, I mean, one is of course it puts a certain pressure on the infrastructure, and hence things go wrong and all of that. But I believe since refugees, as I said, are the lowest rung of the hierarchy of exploitation. I guess we all are being exploited in some form or the other, they're at the lowest level, and so the highest amount of exploitation happens on them, and it is very convenient to blame them for various things, because since they don't have the political power to sort of respond back, or to sort of provide a counter propaganda sort of a thing, so it is easy. So you can blame anything on the refugees, and it works, because we are all so very what should I say, eager to blame all the problems on the most weaker sections of the society. And this is something that happens across the length and breadth of the world, not only India. So I am not sure if the arrival of refugees would lead to an outbreak of diseases in the host society as such. But it is possible, since camps and all are very highly overpopulated, and the very meager space is allotted to a large number of people. It is very possible that there will be an outbreak of diseases within the camp, which is most probably the more likely situation in any given refugee crisis, or any given situation of mass migration. And also, since people who are forced to migrate would be again at the lowest level of, as I said, the hierarchy of exploitation, and may or may not have access to health facilities, either in their own land or in the host society. So one of the ways that it may be sort of done is by arranging some form of basic healthcare, making it available to the refugees, some form of basic healthcare facilities, which is very important, I believe. And the other thing is, it is also advisable to sort of inoculate the children, because it is possible to do that, because of course children will be lesser in number, and also they are the future of the community, and most probably the host society as well. So I believe that vaccination program of various sorts, because children are given lots of vaccines these days. So I guess that is a better approach. And I believe providing some basic stuff like clean water and all would also help in sort of mitigating the outbreak in some form or the other. Well, I mean, and of course, as I said, that I mean, let's say that if you look at the partition and all, I mean, lakhs and lakhs of people were coming, and I mean, nobody can foresee that sort of thing. How do you sort of tackle, that sort of a thing? I think things will go wrong, but yes, the state may sort of chip in and do its bit, and it is possible to sort of, what should I say, mitigate the disaster. It is not possible to sort of completely obviate it. Some things will go wrong, but it is possible to sort of mitigate the impact. And that is where I believe the state has to kind of come into action. The host society may also play a major role by providing some basic facilities, but that is usually not the case, because people are very wary of outsiders, newcomers. So that is a more general human tendency, I believe. Yeah, I don't know if it really answers your question, but that's my feeling about it. Yeah,
So
thank you.
basically, both in terms of environmental degradation, as Professor Shekhar was saying, and in terms of disease outbreaks, it is not really right to blame the refugees completely that they are responsible for our problems. So there's a lot of factors that get involved in the whole situation. So yeah, okay. With this, we now come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much for joining us. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, poems, and essays. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit our website. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay and Professor Somjyoti Mridha for this wonderful and remarkable session today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Am I allowed now? I mean, do I
Yeah,
do?
yes.